Please stand as you are able. The Holy Gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Pray with me. Oh God, you made yourself known in Jesus. Help us in this hour to understand what that means about you, and help us to understand how you want us to make you known in your world. Amen. Leprosy is a disease caused by a bacteria, Mycobacterium lepra. It involves sensory nerves, the nerves that control feeling. It first affects nerves in the legs, rather the fingers and hands, and in the feet, and then later in the face and the head and throughout the body. And people with leprosy become progressively disabled and deformed because they can't feel, and so they traumatize their fingers and their toes, and they just wither away. It's progressively disabling and disfiguring. In 1840, the first case of leprosy was diagnosed in Hawaii. And over the next 30 years, it killed thousands and thousands of people. And in 1868, the government mandated that anyone diagnosed with leprosy would be forcibly evacuated to the island of Molokai, 66 miles across the ocean from Oahu. Conditions in Molokai were abysmal. People lived in caves or in dirty shacks, and they lived there until they died, and then their bodies were buried in superficial graves where they were often eaten by dogs or pigs. In 1873, a Belgian priest named Damien de Verster, who had served in Hawaii for 9 years, felt called by God to move to Molokai, knowing that he might contract leprosy, but knowing that unless he came to live with the lepers, they would never know the love of God. So he did that. He moved there, and the first thing he did was to bring some dignity to death. He created a fenced-in cemetery. He made coffins for people to be buried in, and he established a proper burial group. He helped people build simple, clean houses. He built a church. He tended for the lepers. He dressed their wounds. He ate with them. And over the course of the next few years, that group of lepers had been transformed into a community that had seen God's love in Father Damien. one day after he had been there 11 years, he put his foot in what turned out to be scalding water. The skin, got swelled up, blistered, and he knew two things. He knew that he couldn't feel it, and he knew that he had contracted leprosy. He continued his work, helping the lepers as his disease continued to progress, and he became progressively disabled and deformed. And in his last years, they were awful. He suffered desperately because of loneliness. He was abandoned by his church, ostracized by his bishop. Once the bishop came in a boat near Molokai and would not get off the boat to go in and see Father Damien. And so he died in 1889, 16 years after coming to Molokai, and 5 years after he was diagnosed with leprosy. He had lived with the lepers. He had become one of them. He had suffered and died as they do, and because of that, they had experienced the love of God. Does that story remind you anything about Jesus and his coming? The last verse of our gospel reading today is the climax of the whole passage, and some people say it's the climax of the whole New Testament. These few words, "The Word became flesh and lived among us." They say that because Jesus revealed God to us. Revealed God in ways we never, ever could have seen or known or understood otherwise. I mean, you think about it. What's God described as in the Bible? Some places it says God is light. It's hard to have a relationship with light. Other places he's described as a spirit. Well, those are hard to get to know. And in another place it says God spoke to Abraham from a cloud. Well, that's hard to get to know too, right? The only way we could ever see and know what God is like was for God to become one of us. And so he did. St. Paul says in Philippians, Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be held on to. And in Greek, that's sort of a clutched and grasped and not let go of, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That's not easy to believe, that God became man. In the New York Times today, there's an op-ed editorial that is entitled, "How Can I Possibly Believe That Faith is Better Than Doubt?" It's a little hard to believe. In the 1950s, the British theologian J.B. Phillips wrote a small book that was entitled, When God Became Man. That book was being written by a Baptist minister in Kentucky, and one night before he left, he went out for the evening, and he left the book open on a chair in his study, and while he was gone, the woman who had come to watch their children saw the book, opened it, read it, and was so excited. When he got home, she said, "Is this true? When did it happen? What was he like?" For all of the Christmas services she had gone to, and all of the Christmas hymns that she had heard, she never realized that God had come as a person. And the young minister realized that she didn't know the implications of that, what that meant for us. The first and probably the most important consequence of the incarnation of God coming as a person is that now we have a way of knowing God that we never could have had before. We never had it before, and we never could have had it otherwise, because there are two orders. There's God, the uncreated, and there's the created, everything else. And there's no way that the created could comprehend the uncreated unless the uncreated made himself known. So he did. As Paul says, Jesus was the visible image of the invisible God. And to the question that humankind has asked ever since the beginning, what is God like? The answer is, like Jesus. Perhaps the most important thing that Jesus showed us about God is that God is a God of love. Now, Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friend." But in fact, there is a greater love than that God laid down his life for his enemies. A second consequence of the incarnation is that God can be a companion to us in our existence because he has experienced life here. There was once a young minister in Appalachia who was pastoring in a small church, and this was in the foothills of Appalachia. One of the farmer deacons in that church died, and the young minister was asked to do the funeral service. Well, he had never done one. He really wanted to do it well. He read several books about grief. And on the day of the funeral, he went to the widow and he said whatever words he could to her. She received them graciously, but he realized as he walked away, there was no way for him to say anything really meaningful for her because he had never experienced death. He had never been a person of sorrow. And a few minutes later, he saw another woman walk up to the widow, tears coming down her face, put her arms around the widow and say, I know how you feel. I understand. I'm so sorry. That woman had lost her husband 6 months before. So she knew what it was like to experience that. Because God came in Jesus, God knows what it's like to be human. He has faced struggles that we face. He faced temptation. He faced the situation where you bring good news to people and they reject it. He faced the rejection of love that was offered and was rejected. He knew what it was like to have friends betray him, what it was like to suffer, and like you, to feel abandoned by God. He knew what it was like to die. But because of that, he is no longer a remote spirit, a voice in a cloud, a distant light. He is Emmanuel, God with us. When I was preparing this sermon, one of the things I read said, one preaching on Christmas cannot proclaim the birth of the baby Jesus without also proclaiming the purpose of that birth. Through his living, dying, and rising, Christ reveals to us the God we could not otherwise know. That's true. And that God is a God of love, a love that without Jesus we could never have imagined or believed or known. But God wanted us to know, and so Jesus came. Thanks be to God.